Imagine the fluid in your eyes actually beginning to thicken.
Oh, God.
Yeah. You are standing on this vast, totally featureless plain of white, but you can't actually see it because the sun hasn't risen in 3 months.
Right. Absolute darkness.
Pitch black. The temperature has plunged to 50 degrees below zero. And, it's the kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin. It fundamentally alters the physics of your surroundings.
Breaks biology.
Exactly. Your breath doesn't even mist. It instantly crystallizes, just falling like microscopic snow. Every time you inhale, it feels like you're dragging crushed glass directly into your lungs.
Because the moisture in your airway is literally freezing.
Right. And then there is the sound. Out of this pitch black void comes a deafening, just bone-rattling screech.
Like metal tearing.
Yeah, it sounds like a skyscraper being ripped apart by bare hands. Just steel groaning against steel. But it isn't metal. It is millions of tons of multi-year pack ice.
Just driven by deep, unstoppable ocean currents.
Violently crushing against the wooden hull of the ship you are standing on, you feel the heavy oak deck beneath your boots buckling upward. And with absolute terrifying certainty that if that hull shatters, you will either be cast into the freezing black water or simply pulverized.
Wow. I mean, it is a sensory nightmare that the human brain is entirely unequipped to process.
It really is.
You're describing an environment that is actively mechanically hostile to human life. When you are in the high Arctic winter, you are not just surviving a season, you're surviving an alien world.
And what we're exploring today in our deep dive into the historical sources, this isn't a work of fiction. It's not a horror screenplay.
No, not at all.
This was the very real, agonizing fate of 129 men who sailed off the edge of the known map into that white void and just slowly, systematically vanished.
It's terrifying.
So welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to reconstruct one of the most chilling, macabre maritime mysteries in human history, Captain Sir John Franklin's 1845 Arctic expedition.
And we have so much to go through.
We really do. We're pulling from a massive stack of sources today. We have original 1840s Admiralty blueprints. We have these desperate letters sent home. We have Inuit oral histories that were ignored for a century.
Which is a whole tragedy in itself.
Right. And we even have the gruesome 1980s forensic autopsies of the men who didn't make it. So we are going to put all of these pieces together to understand exactly what happened out there in the dark.
Because when you lay these sources out side by side, a terrifying picture emerges. I mean, this isn't just a story about bad weather.
No.
It is a meticulous, slow-motion documentation of what happens when Victorian hubris and untested industrial technology collide with a completely merciless environment.
The ocean doesn't care.
Exactly. The Arctic ice does not care about your rank or your social standing or the fancy steam engines in your ship. It only cares about physics.
Right. So to understand how 129 highly trained men end up trapped in this icy slaughterhouse, we have to look at the socio-political climate that birthed this disaster, the pride before the freeze.
The 1840s British Empire.
Yeah. The year is 1845. The British Empire is the undisputed master of the globe. They control the oceans. And at the center of this naval dominance is Sir John Burrough. He's the second secretary of the Admiralty.
And he's getting old at this point.
Yeah, he is 82 years old, staring down the end of his life, and he has this burning, almost religious obsession. He wants to complete the navigation of the Northwest Passage.
Which, was the holy grail of maritime exploration back then. I mean, for over 300 years, European powers had been throwing ships and lives at the Arctic.
Just desperately trying to find a shortcut.
Right, a sea route from Europe over the top of the Americas to the trading markets of Asia. By 1845, thanks to decades of prior expeditions, the British Admiralty had actually mapped vast stretches of the Canadian Arctic.
So they were getting close.
They had narrowed the unknown portion down to a specific quadrilateral area. It was about 70,000 square miles.
Which is still massive.
It is, but to Burrough, this was just a clerical error, waiting to be fixed. He believed that if they simply brute forced their way through this one last blank spot on the map, they would connect the Atlantic and the Pacific.
And Burrough also subscribed to this incredibly dangerous piece of pseudoscience called the open polar sea theory.
Right, yeah. This is wild. So there was a prevailing belief among certain geographers that sea ice only formed near land.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They theorized that if you could just punch through the initial barrier of coastal ice, you would emerge into a warm, temperate, navigable ocean at the top of the world.
A warm ocean at the North Pole, that is insane.
It was complete fantasy. But you have to understand, it dictated their risk assessment. They thought the hardest part would simply be getting past the ice rim.
Wow. Okay, so Barrow needs a commander to punch through this rim for his grand final expedition. He needs a hero. But the man who actually gets the job, Sir John Franklin, he is essentially the leftover option.
Yeah, he was the reluctant fourth choice.
Right.
The Admiralty went down a list of men who actually understood the modern ice, and one by one, they struck out. William Edward Parry, a legendary Arctic navigator, was simply exhausted and told them no.
He had had enough.
Exactly. James Clark Ross, another seasoned veteran, had just returned from Antarctica and promised his new wife he wouldn't go back to the ice. James Fitzjames was deemed too young to command.
And then there's Francis Crozier.
Right. Crozier was arguably the most competent and experienced ice navigator alive at the time. But he was rejected for command because he was Irish and of humble birth.
That's just infuriating.
It is. In the deeply rigid, class-obsessed hierarchy of the Victorian Royal Navy, your pedigree mattered a lot more than your competence.
So the wheel of bureaucracy stops on Sir John Franklin. And let's look at Franklin the man based on the historical accounts. He is 59 years old. He is quite overweight.
Not exactly in his physical prime.
No, not at all. He's a veteran, certainly. He survived some horrific overland Arctic expeditions decades prior, where he famously had to eat his own leather boots to survive.
The man who ate his boots.
Yeah, but his prime exploring days are long gone. Plus, he had recently been recalled from a disastrous stint as the lieutenant governor of Van Diemen's Land, which is modern-day Tasmania.
Right, so his reputation was really bruised.
Exactly.
The psychological burden on Franklin from the moment he accepted this post must have been staggering. I mean, he knew he wasn't the first choice. He knew his career was on a downward trajectory.
And suddenly, he is handed the keys to the kingdom.
Right. He gets the most technologically advanced, heavily funded expedition the British Empire has ever assembled. He was carrying the expectations of an entire civilization, the need to redeem his own legacy, and the lives of a massive crew.
You know, if I try to put myself in his shoes, standing on the deck as they prepare to launch, that pressure is like a physical weight. Does he feel like he has to prove the Admiralty wrong?
He must have.
Does he feel this desperate need to succeed no matter what? Because when you look at the decisions he makes later, like the refusal to turn back, the choice to push the ships into these lethal bottlenecks, it looks like the behavior of a man who believes failure is simply not a politically viable option.
That psychological framework is critical here. When the commander's primary drive is validating his own worth to the Admiralty, risk mitigation takes a backseat to aggressive forward momentum.
He's pushing forward no matter the cost.
Yeah, and he felt insulated from that risk because of the ships he was given.
Oh man, let's talk about those ships. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. The sources detail their architecture, and it is fascinating. These weren't standard exploration vessels.
No, not at all. These were former bomb vessels.
Right. And for the listener who might not know marine architecture, a bomb vessel wasn't designed to move fast or look pretty. It was designed to carry massive multi-ton siege mortars.
Huge artillery.
Yeah, and when a mortar fires, the downward recoil is so violent it would shatter a normal ship's spine. So bomb vessels were built with skeletons of solid English oak, with the wooden ribs set impossibly close together.
Cross-braced with immense internal beams, they were floating fortresses.
Floating fortresses, exactly.
And the Admiralty took these massive wooden blocks and heavily modified them for the ice. They strapped heavy iron plates to the bows to act as armor. But the real shift in their technological approach was internal.
This is the crazy part.
Yeah, they took the ships to the Woolwich dockyard, stripped out the lower decks, and literally lowered in massive steam engines completely pulled from railway locomotives.
That is such an insane image to me. Taking a train engine meant to roll on iron tracks through the English countryside and dropping it into a wooden boat going to the North Pole.
I know. They used a London and Greenwich railway engine for Erebus and likely a London and Birmingham railway engine for Terror.
Just massive machines.
Yeah, they hooked these massive 20-ton iron beasts up to complex gearing systems that drove retractable screw propellers. This meant that for the first time in history, an Arctic expedition did not have to rely entirely on the wind.
That's a huge shift in mindset.
Right. If the wind died, or if they were in a narrow ice channel, they could fire up the locomotive engines and push through the water at a steady 4 knots.
And they didn't stop there. They ran a network of pipes through the lower decks, using the steam from the engines to create internal central heating for the crew.
Steam heating in 1845.
Yeah. And then we look at the inventory manifest from the sources. This is where you really see the Victorian hubris not just as a concept, but as actual physical weight on the ship.
Oh, the cargo's unbelievable.
They didn't just pack survival gear, they packed a massive library of over 1,200 books.
1,200 bucks.
They packed heavy mahogany writing desks, fine silver cutlery, crystalline decanters, silk handkerchiefs. They brought along a pet monkey
A monkey.
to the Arctic. They packed thousands of pounds of mustard and chocolate.
I mean, they weren't outfitting a survival mission. They were transporting a high society London gentleman's club into the most lethal environment on Earth.
Exactly.
And this is exactly the danger of untested technology.
Yeah.
When you are sitting in a steam-heated cabin, surrounded by mahogany and 1,200 books, listening to the steady hum of a railway engine pushing you forward, you experience a profound cognitive disconnect.
You feel invincible.
You do. It isolates you from the reality of the environment. You stop seeing the Arctic as an active predator. You view it as a mere landscape waiting to be paved over by British engineering.
You know, it's exactly like looking at a modern billionaire's luxury submersible.
Oh, wow, yes.
Right. You pack it with flat screens and supposedly cutting-edge tech. You drive it with a gaming controller, and you just assume the deep ocean is going to step aside because you have a lot of money and confidence.
It's the exact same psychological trap.
You prioritize the illusion of control over the mechanics of survival. And that brings us to the most glaring, fatal flaw in their entire logistical preparation: the food.
Yeah, the Admiralty needed to supply the expedition with 3 years' worth of provisions. Now, tinned food was relatively new technology at the time, but it was seen as a miracle of modern science.
A way to conquer scurvy and hunger.
Right. On April 1st, 1845, the Admiralty awarded the massive contract for tinned meat and soup to a merchant named Stephen Goldner.
April 1st. And the expedition set sail on May 19th. That is exactly 7 weeks.
7 weeks to procure the meat, manufacture the tin canisters, cook the food, fill the tins, and solder them completely shut.
And we are talking about massive quantities.
He was contracted for 8,000 massive, heavy tins. It was an impossible industrial timeline.
And because of that breakneck, panicked haste, the quality control simply evaporated. We know this because when archaeologists later recovered some of these tins from the Arctic, they found that the lead soldering used to seal the lids was shockingly sloppy.
It wasn't a clean seal at all.
No. The toxic lead was applied thickly, haphazardly, and it literally dripped down the inside surfaces of the metal. It hardened like melted candle wax directly into the space where the soup and meat was stored.
Which means the food they would rely on for years was sitting in a bath of highly toxic heavy metal.
Just marinating in lead.
And the Admiralty never checked. I mean, they checked the brass buttons on the officers' uniforms, they made sure the crystal decanters were stowed securely, but they didn't systematically inspect the biochemical safety of the calories that would keep their men's hearts beating.
It's a perfect encapsulation of their blind spots. They focused on the macro, like the massive engines and the armor plating, and completely ignored the micro.
But the illusion of invincibility only lasts until the shoreline disappears.
Right. So in May 1845, 134 men sail out of Greenhithe, England. They make a brief stop in Scotland, and then they cross the Atlantic to Disco Bay on the western coast of Greenland.
Which is their absolute last touch point with human civilization.
At Disco Bay, they transfer their final supplies from a transport ship that accompanied them. They slaughter 10 oxen for fresh meat to hang in the rigging.
5 men actually fall ill or are deemed unfit and are discharged back to England here.
Those were the lucky ones.
The luckiest men alive. That brings the final crew manifest down to 129 men. And this is where they write their final letters home.
Yeah, when you read these letters in the source material, there's a profound, eerie normalcy to them. They are complaining about mundane things.
Like Franklin's rules.
Right. They note that Captain Franklin has instituted a strict ban on swearing and drunkenness to maintain moral purity on the ship. They talk about the cold, but with this sense of adventure.
There is absolutely zero premonition of the nightmare waiting for them.
None. You are reading the words of men who are completely unaware that they are drafting their own epitaphs.
So on July 26, 1845, 2 European whaling ships, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, spot Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay.
The last sighting.
Yeah. The whalers report that the expedition is moored to an iceberg, waiting for a break in the ice conditions so they can cross westward into Lancaster Sound.
Just waiting for the ice to open up.
The crews wave to each other across the freezing water. The whalers turn back toward Europe. The expedition fires up its engines, slips into the white void, And no European ever sees a single one of those 129 men alive again.
And this is where the narrative shifts. We no longer have official naval logs sent back to London. From this point forward, to reconstruct the timeline, we have to read the landscape itself.
The archaeology.
Right. We have to look at the archaeological record, the forensic chemistry of bones, and the oral histories of the Inuit who witnessed the final horrific acts of the tragedy.
We know from the physical evidence left behind that they successfully navigated through Lancaster Sound. They found a small, desolate outcrop of rock and gravel called Beachy Island, and they set up their camp to overwinter for the first time, from the fall of 1845 to the spring of 1846.
Let's explain the mechanics of overwintering, because to a modern listener, parking a ship for the winter sounds like, I don't know, a vacation. What does this environmental reality actually look like?
Well, overwintering in the high Arctic is an extreme, prolonged survival scenario. As the temperature plummets in September, the surface of the ocean literally stops moving.
It just freezes.
Freezes solid around the hull of the ship. You are no longer sailing. You are trapped in a wooden fortress encased in concrete hard ice.
Wow.
The crew unrigs the sails, strikes the upper masts, and essentially builds a massive tent over the upper deck using heavy canvas to try and trap whatever heat they can. And then the sun sets.
And it doesn't come back.
No.
For roughly 3 months, you are in absolute suffocating darkness. The temperature drops to 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees below zero.
And the physical isolation is absolute. You have 129 men crammed into the lower decks of 2 ships. Remember, they have the steam heating from the locomotive engines.
Oh, right, so it's warm down there.
It's warm enough to survive, but it is incredibly damp from the steam. You have over 100 unwashed men living in close quarters, breathing recirculated air, surrounded by the smell of coal smoke, damp wool, and the creeping odor of sickness.
It's during this first winter at Beachy Island that the creeping realization of their mortality must have really set in. The grand adventure of British exploration suddenly becomes a claustrophobic fight for sanity.
Definitely.
And it is here that the expedition suffers its first 3 casualties. John Torrington, a 20-year-old stoker who worked the massive engines, John Hartnell, a 25-year-old able seaman, and William Brain, a 32-year-old Royal Marine.
3 healthy young men, dead before the ships had even truly entered the unknown portion of the map.
I want you, the listener, to visualize this moment because it is a massive psychological turning point. Imagine the crew, wrapped in heavy, damp wool coats, standing on the desolate, completely frozen earth of Beachy Island in the twilight.
The wind is howling.
They have to use heavy iron pickaxes to violently hack through the rock-hard permafrost just to create a cavity deep enough for a coffin. They lower their 3 crewmates into the freezing dirt.
They hammer wooden markers into the ground.
And then, as the ice finally thaws in the brief summer of 1846, they raise the sails, fire up the locomotive engines, and they leave them behind. They sail onward into the unknown, leaving 3 lonely graves staring out at the empty gray sea.
The veneer of invincibility is gone at this point. The reality of death in the Arctic has been established. But Franklin, driven by that immense pressure to succeed we talked about, pushes onward.
He has to.
They leave Beachy Island, sail south down Peel Sound, and head directly toward King William Island. And this is where Franklin, looking at the charts, makes the single most fatal geographical error of the entire expedition.
Yeah. When you look at the map of King William Island, there are 2 ways to sail around it to continue south, the east side or the west side.
And the environmental mechanisms of those 2 sides are vastly different. The route down the east coast of King William Island is generally sheltered from the deep ocean currents.
So it's safer.
Much safer. It is somewhat protected, and crucially, it often clears of ice during the brief summer thaw. In fact, decades later in 1903, that is the exact route Roald Amundsen used to successfully navigate the Northwest Passage. He went east.
But Franklin went west.
Franklin, likely operating on faulty maps and the hubris that his steamships could handle anything, chose the west side.
And the west side of King William Island is not just a difficult route, it is a geographic meat grinder.
That is the perfect way to describe it.
Yeah.
The west side borders the Victoria Strait, and the ocean currents in the Arctic act like a massive one-way conveyor belt.
Pushing the ice.
They push colossal amounts of multi-year pack ice down from the deep polar basin and cram it directly into the Victoria Strait, pinning it against the western shore of King William Island.
We need to define multi-year pack ice for the listener because this isn't the flat, smooth ice you skate on over a pond.
No.
When ice freezes, melts slightly, freezes again, and gets violently crushed together by wind and currents over several years, it creates something monstrous. It forms jagged, chaotic ridges that can be 20, 30 feet thick.
It is as hard as granite.
Exactly. It is a plowing train of ice that simply does not melt, even in the absolute height of the summer sun. It is a permanent, crushing bottleneck.
And in September 1846, Erebus and Terror, with their steam engines churning, sailed directly into it.
Jesus.
The ice closes in behind them like a vault door locking shut. They are physically pinned.
They will never sail again. The ships become stationary structures in a shifting, violent landscape. And the only direct written evidence we have from the crew about what happens next comes from a single piece of paper.
The Victory Point Note.
Yeah. And it is arguably the most terrifying artifact in naval history. It was found years later by a search party, hidden inside a sealed tin cylinder under a pile of stones.
The document is actually 2 separate notes, written on the exact same piece of paper, separated by 11 months, and the contrast between them tells the entire story of their psychological collapse.
Walk us through the first one.
The first note is dated May 28, 1847. It gives their coordinates. It mentions they wintered at Beechy Island. And it ends with a very standard, optimistic naval sign-off. Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition. All well.
All well. I mean, it is a chilling piece of historical irony.
It really is.
Because written in the margins of that exact same piece of paper, physically encircling that optimistic message in erratic, panicked handwriting, is the second note.
The doom note.
This one is dated April 25, 1848, 11 months later, and the information it contains is a nightmare.
The second note states that the ships have been trapped in the ice, unmoving, for a year and 7 months. It states that the ships have been officially abandoned.
Abandoning the fortresses.
It lists the casualty count. 24 officers and crew are dead. And it drops a bombshell. Sir John Franklin died on June 11, 1847.
Which is just 2 weeks after that first all-well note was written.
Exactly. The new commander, Captain Crozier, states that the 105 survivors have dropped over the side of the ships and are going to start marching south toward the back river tomorrow.
We have to stop and unpack the sheer horror of that 11-month gap. What mechanically and psychologically happens to a crew of over 100 men locked in 2 wooden ships, enduring the crushing pressure of the ice for nearly 2 years.
It's hard to even fathom.
First, consider the auditory terror. The ice isn't a static parking lot. It is constantly shifting, driven by currents miles below. The immense blocks grind against the oak hull of the ship.
The acoustic environment alone would drive you to the brink of madness. You are living, sleeping, and eating in perpetual darkness, listening to the ship's massive structural timbers scream and pop under the pressure.
Just waiting for the wood to snap.
You know that at any second, a sudden pressure ridge could form, splinter the hull like a matchstick, and the freezing water will rush in.
But the ice didn't crush them. The true killer was inside the ships. As they endure the winter of 1846, they are waiting for the summer of 1847. They are praying for the thaw.
Right, watching the calendar.
Waiting for the temperature to rise so the ice will crack and they can sail free. But the thaw never comes. The Victoria Strait remains completely frozen. The realization hits them. They're going to spend a second consecutive winter locked in the dark.
And as that second winter sets in, the internal biome of the ships becomes toxic. We mentioned the steam heating.
Right.
It kept them from freezing to death. But the constant humidity in a sealed, unventilated wooden tube created the perfect breeding ground for respiratory disease. The air was a thick, damp fog of unwashed bodies, coal dust, and bacteria.
Like a petri dish.
The historical sources and later forensic evidence strongly suggest that tuberculosis and pneumonia began ripping through the crew.
If you are sitting in your living room right now, just imagine the acoustics of that lower deck. It's pitch black. The ice is shrieking against the hull outside, and inside all you can hear is the relentless, echoing, wet coughing of men slowly drowning in their own lung fluid.
And the smell.
The smell of copper and sickness is everywhere. And we haven't even talked about the scurvy yet.
Oh, scurvy. Scurvy is one of the most horrific ways a human body can degrade. We think of it as just a vitamin deficiency, but the mechanics of it are grotesque.
It's so much worse than people think.
Vitamin C is a crucial building block for synthesizing collagen. Collagen is essentially the biological mortar that holds your cellular structures together. It makes up your blood vessels, your skin, your scar tissue.
So when you are completely deprived of fresh food for years, your body stops making that mortar.
Exactly. Without collagen, your body structurally unravels. Your gums swell, turn purple, and become so spongy your teeth literally fall out of your head. Your capillaries become fragile, so you develop massive internal bruising from the slightest touch. Your joints ache with such severe inflammation that you cannot walk.
And then there's the old injuries.
And most horrifyingly, the old scars you got years ago from a childhood cut or an old injury literally dissolve and spontaneously reopen because the scar tissue holding them shut disintegrates. The men were rotting while they were still breathing.
And as the physical bodies fell apart, the rigid Victorian naval discipline, the only thing keeping them sane, began to collapse. The officers are dying. Franklin is dead. The hierarchy is crumbling.
It's total chaos.
Put yourself in the mind of Captain Crozier on April 25th, 1848. He unscrews the tin cylinder. He pulls out the paper with the old handwriting that says, "All well." He takes his pen, crosses it out, and writes the doom of his men in the margin.
Such a heavy moment.
What level of absolute bottomless despair does it take to look at your heavily armored ship, your only source of heat, your only shelter from the wind, and decide, staying here is a guaranteed death. We have to leave the ships. We have to walk out onto the jagged, frozen ocean.
It is a decision born of absolute terminal desperation.
Yeah.
I mean, they knew they were trading a slow, agonizing death by disease in the ships for a highly probable, violently quick death from exposure on the ice.
But they had to try.
But staying meant starving in a tomb.
Yeah.
Walking meant a fraction of a percent of a chance at survival. They planned to walk south across the sea ice to King William Island and then drag their lifeboats down the coast toward the Canadian mainland.
Hoping to row up the back river to a fur trading outpost hundreds of miles away.
Yes.
So on April 26, 1848, the 105 survivors step off the ships. They leave the mahogany desks, they leave the steam engines, they step into the blinding white void, and they begin the death march.
And we can reconstruct the grim reality of this march from the physical evidence left behind. Later search parties, like the one led by Francis Leopold McClintock in 1859, followed their trail.
What did they find?
They found the physical remnants of the collapse. They found human skeletons scattered along the desolate gravel coast, men who had simply dropped to their knees in the snow and died where they fell, left behind by their comrades.
But the most staggering, inexplicable discovery McClintock made was on the western extreme of the island. They found one of the ship's massive wooden lifeboats, but it wasn't in the water.
No, it was mounted on a heavy iron runner sledge.
Inside the boat were two human skeletons, one at the bow, one at the stern. And scattered in and around this boat was the equipment the men had harnessed themselves to drag across the ice.
The inventory of that lifeboat provides a macabre, terrifying window into the cognitive state of the crew.
It makes no sense.
These men were starving. They were crippled by scurvy. They were trying to drag thousands of pounds of dead weight across razor-sharp ridges of pack ice. You would expect to find extra rations, harpoons, survival gear. But that isn't what McClintock found.
No, they found heavy boots, scented soap, delicate sponges, slippers, hair combs, silk handkerchiefs, brass uniform buttons.
Scented soap while starving to death.
Heavy silver cutlery engraved with their initials, and a massive stack of heavy books, including the Oliver Goldsmith fiction novel, The Vicar of Wakefield.
It is sheer madness. From a biomechanical standpoint, the caloric cost of dragging an oak boat over uneven ice is immense. To actively choose to increase that burden with scented soap and a fiction novel points directly to total cognitive collapse.
So what happened to their minds?
There are two overlapping theories for this behavior, and both are deeply unsettling. First, there's the psychological theory. As their reality disintegrated, as the starvation and the cold stripped away their humanity, they desperately, irrationally clung to the physical totems of Victorian civilization.
Trying to hold on to who they were.
The silver forks, the books, these were proof that they were still gentlemen of the Royal Navy. To leave them behind was to admit they had been reduced to desperate animals.
I picture it like someone waking up to their house engulfed in flames. The fire is literally melting the paint off the walls. And instead of grabbing a fire extinguisher or their phone to call for help, they carefully wrap a set of fragile, incredibly heavy porcelain teacups in a blanket and try to carry them out the front door.
It's a great analogy.
It is a snapshot of a human mind that has completely snapped under the trauma.
The second theory is physiological, and it is backed by the modern forensics we will discuss later. We now know these men were suffering from acute, severe lead poisoning.
Right.
Lead is a biological imposter. When it enters the body, it mimics calcium. It easily crosses the blood-brain barrier and begins to degrade the myelin sheaths around your neurons.
Destroying the brain physically.
One of the primary symptoms of acute lead encephalopathy is profound neurological damage. Severe paranoia, hallucinations, erratic mood swings, and a total inability to make rational, logical decisions.
So they weren't just culturally clinging to their silver spoons. Their brains were literally, structurally grating. They were marching south into the freezing wind, harnessed like draft horses to a sledge full of soap, led by poisoned, paranoid minds.
And as the mind breaks, the body inevitably follows. The march stretched out over weeks, dragging into months. The rations ran out. The terrain was impassable. And this leads us to the darkest, most taboo chapter of the entire Franklin saga.
Starvation Cove.
A place the local Inuit would later name Starvation Cove.
For nearly a decade after they vanished, the British public back in London assumed the men had died noble, tragic deaths. They envisioned them freezing in prayer, wrapped in the Union Jack.
A heroic fantasy.
But in 1854, an explorer named John Rae, who was surveying the Canadian Arctic coast for the Hudson's Bay Company, encountered local Inuit hunters. Through an interpreter, Rae asked if they had seen any white men, and the Inuit told him a story that shattered the Victorian myth.
The Inuit oral history, which Rae dutifully recorded and sent back to the Admiralty, was incredibly detailed. They said that a few years prior, roughly in 1850, they had seen a party of 35 to 40 starving white men dragging a boat south near the mouth of the Back River.
Just a fraction of the crew left.
They communicated through signs that their ships had been crushed in the ice and they were going south to shoot birds. The Inuit sold them a small piece of seal meat and left. Later, the Inuit returned to the area. They found the camp, they found the graves, and they found the bodies of the dead in tents and under the overturned boat.
Oh, it was the condition of the bodies that shocked John Rae to his core.
Yes, the Inuit testimony stated unequivocally that from the mutilated state of many of the corpses and the contents of the cooking kettles, the last surviving members of the Franklin expedition had been driven to cannibalism.
And the Inuit didn't just have a story. They had physical proof. They showed Rae items they had scavenged from the dead men. They handed him heavy silver forks and spoons. And engraved on the handles of that silver were the crests and initials of Captain Crozier, Captain Fitzjames, and Sir John Franklin himself. Imagine being John Rae standing in the freezing wind holding this incredibly fine Victorian silver and hearing the horrific, gruesome context of how it was recovered.
When Rae's report reached London, it caused an absolute socio-cultural meltdown.
I can imagine.
Victorian society violently, aggressively rejected the Inuit testimony. Charles Dickens, one of the most famous men in the world, wrote scathing, racist articles in his magazine, dismissing the Inuit as babbling savages.
Wow.
The prevailing attitude was pure arrogance. Gentlemen of the Royal Navy, armed with the light of Christianity, do not eat each other. Lady Franklin spent a massive fortune funding expeditions specifically designed to disprove the cannibalism theory. They could accept that the ice killed the men, but they could not accept that the veneer of modern civilization had cracked.
But the truth always leaves a mark on the earth. Over a century later, modern science proved the Inuit were telling the exact truth. In 1992, a team of archaeologists and forensic anthropologists excavated a specific site on the western coast of King William Island known as NGLJ2.
The bone site.
They carefully brushed away the frozen dirt and uncovered nearly 400 human bones and bone fragments.
Dr. Ann Keenlyside, the forensic scientist on the expedition, examined those bones under high magnification. What she found was undeniable. Roughly 1/4 of the bones she examined had distinct, microscopic V-shaped blade cut marks on them.
V-shaped marks?
The marks were not random. They were highly concentrated around the major joint articulations, the elbows, the knees, and along the major muscle masses.
What does that mean structurally?
It means the cuts were purposeful. They were entirely consistent with systematic, intentional defleshing and dismemberment. Furthermore, some of the larger bones had been violently cracked open, suggesting the survivors were extracting the marrow for its dense caloric value. The men of the Franklin expedition had absolutely resorted to eating your own dead.
It is the ultimate horror of this narrative. I want us to pause and truly try to conceptualize that moment. We're talking about men who trained together, who drank together in the pubs of London, who prayed together on the decks of the ship.
They were brothers.
How does a crew reach the point where they look at each other in the snow with hollow eyes and decide who lives and who becomes sustenance?
It forces us to confront the rawest, most terrifying biological imperative of the human body. When starvation reaches its terminal phase, The body begins consuming its own organs to keep the brain functioning.
The pain must be unimaginable.
The psychological barriers, the moral codes, the religious doctrines that civilization builds over centuries, all of it simply dissolves in the face of primal survival. They didn't do it out of malice or madness. They did it because the biochemical drive to take one more breath, to live one more hour, overrides every single cognitive function.
The sheer, crushing isolation of it is what haunts me. Dying in the snow, hundreds of miles from the absolute edge of the known world, your friends butchering a corpse just a few feet away, knowing with absolute certainty that no one is coming to save you.
But people were trying to save them.
Right. But the tragic irony of the Franklin expedition is that the disappearance of Franklin triggered the most massive rescue effort in maritime history. But the Arctic is a giant, icy spiderweb. The more you thrash, the more ships you send in, the more the ice catches. Which brings us to the echoes of doom and the terrifying fate of HMS Investigator.
The search for Franklin became a national crusade. By 1850, there were 11 British and 2 American ships actively scouring the Arctic, desperately looking for a sign.
A massive fleet.
One of these ships was HMS Investigator, captained by Robert McClure. His mission was unique. Instead of entering the passage from the Atlantic side like Franklin, he was ordered to sail around South America, enter the Arctic from the Pacific side via the Bering Strait, and search eastward.
And McClure sails his ship right into the exact same geographical meat grinder.
Almost exactly. In 1851, the Investigator enters a deep inlet on the northern coast of Banks Island called Mercy Bay. The winter ice sets in. But just like Franklin, when the summer of 1852 rolls around, the ice doesn't break.
Oh, no.
The Investigator becomes completely icebound. And they don't just get stuck for one winter. They are trapped in the ice, unmoving, for over 2 years.
2 years. Put yourself in their boots. They were sitting in the freezing dark, below decks, knowing exactly what likely happened to Franklin. They're looking out at the same featureless white void, realizing they're experiencing the exact same fatal sequence of events.
It's a terrifying, almost ghostly parallel. As the second year drags on, the rations are cut, the dampness sets in, and the scurvy begins to rot the crew. In April 1853, 3 crew members die of the disease.
2 able seamen and a gunner's mate.
Yes. The remaining 63 men are starving, their health is failing, and McClure makes the same desperate calculation Crozier made. He prepares to abandon the ship and lead his weakened men on a desperate overland death march.
But the Investigator crew gets lucky. Miraculously, impossibly lucky.
Yes, they do. Just days before they are scheduled to abandon ship and step out onto the ice, a Royal Navy sledge team from another search ship, HMS Resolute, spots them.
Talk about timing.
It's one of the most dramatic rescues in naval history. The 63 surviving men abandon the Investigator in Mercy Bay and are marched over the ice to safety. Because they entered from the west and were rescued by a ship from the east, they actually become the first men to effectively transit the Northwest Passage.
Oh, wow.
But they do it by walking over the frozen ocean after losing their ship.
The Investigator is left behind, a wooden ghost ship locked in the ice. And this is where the story fast-forwards to the modern era, creating a tangible bridge between the Victorian nightmare and our modern world. In 2010, Parks Canada launched an expedition specifically to find the wreck of the Investigator.
And they found it fast.
Within hours of dropping a sonar towfish into the freezing waters of Mercy Bay, they find it.
The discovery is breathtaking. Because the water in the Arctic is so incredibly cold and devoid of the wood-boring shipworms found in warmer oceans, the wreck is phenomenally preserved. The ship is sitting perfectly upright, resting on the bottom in just 11 meters of water.
It's so shallow.
In fact, the upper deck is only 8 meters below the surface. It is sitting there, frozen in time, exactly where McClure abandoned it in 1853.
But it's what the land search team found that truly brings the human tragedy into focus. A team led by archaeologist Henry Carey went ashore on Banks Island, looking for the cache of emergency supplies the crew had dumped before they were rescued. And about 60 meters from that cache, on a desolate, windswept ridge, they found the graves of the 3 men who died of scurvy.
And this is where the unique, horrific environment of the Arctic creates a very haunting reality. Henry Carey noted that when you look at these graves, they don't look like they are 150 years old. They look like freshly dug grave shafts. The earth is still piled high, mounded in the center.
Why is that significant? Normally, in a temperate climate, when a body decomposes and the wooden coffin rots away, the earth above it sinks, creating a noticeable depression or divot in the ground.
Exactly. The fact that the mounds are still elevated means the soil underneath hasn't collapsed. It means the permafrost, The permanently frozen layer of Earth has likely kept the bodies underneath in a state of near-perfect frozen preservation.
Just frozen solid.
A magnetometer scan run over the site even picked up the magnetic signatures of the metal nails holding the coffins together and possibly the copper nameplates nailed to the lids.
Knowing what they went through, the slow rotting of scurvy, the terror of the ice, and knowing their bodies are sitting perfectly preserved just a few feet beneath the dirt, it's chilling. But Parks Canada made a very deliberate, ethical decision regarding those graves.
They decided not to excavate them. They recognized that these are not just archaeological curiosities. They are the final resting places of British sailors who died in service to their country.
Let them rest.
The scientific value of digging them up did not outweigh the moral imperative to let them rest. For now, the men of the Investigator are left in peace, sleeping in the permafrost, guarded by the wind.
But the graves of Franklin's first three casualties, Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain, buried back on Beechey Island during that first winter, were not left alone. Because in order to understand why the Franklin expedition failed so catastrophically, science needed to literally look the dead in the eye.
The science of the grave.
Right. And that brings us to the faces of the dead.
In the early 1980s, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Alberta named Dr. Owen Beattie became obsessed with solving the Franklin mystery. He had previously found scattered bone fragments on King William Island that showed unusually high levels of lead.
But bones only tell part of the story.
Right. Analyzing bone only tells you about lifetime exposure. Lead accumulates in bones over decades. To prove that a massive, acute dose of lead poisoning happened during the expedition itself, Beattie needed soft tissue. He needed hair, and he needed fingernails. He needed the completely intact bodies buried in the permafrost of Beechey Island.
In August 1984, Beattie and his team travel to that desolate, freezing rock. They stand over the grave of John Torrington, the 20-year-old stoker. They start to dig. It is brutal work.
The ground is like rock.
The permafrost is like concrete. They have to use picks, and they literally pour warm water into the hole to slowly thaw the earth inch by inch. It takes days. Finally, they hit the wood of the coffin. They carefully pry off the lid, and the image of what they saw inside is permanently, violently burned into my brain.
The photograph of John Torrington's exhumation is one of the most famous, visceral, and haunting images in all of historical archaeology. Because of the freezing mechanism of the permafrost, the decay process was halted almost immediately after he was buried.
It's unreal.
Torrington was perfectly preserved. It looked like he had been put in the ground yesterday.
Describe it for the listener, because seeing it is like looking at a ghost. He is wearing a pale blue cotton shirt with thin white stripes. His eyes are slightly open, staring blankly upward. His lips are a dark, bruised blue.
His limbs are tied.
His limbs are tightly bound with strips of cloth to keep them straight for the coffin. He is a Victorian sailor, perfectly frozen in time, staring back at the scientists 138 years after he took his last breath.
It is intensely visceral. You're looking directly at a primary casualty of this nightmare. Beattie's team performs careful, methodical autopsies in the freezing wind. They take tissue samples, they rebury Torrington, and then they exhume the other two, John Hartnell and Private William Brain.
And Brain's grave is something else entirely.
Yeah. Brain's grave in particular tells a very dark story about the rapidly deteriorating state of the crew's psychology by the time he died in April 1846.
Torrington's burial was neat and respectful, but when they opened Brain's coffin, they saw physical evidence of panic.
Brain's burial showed signs of extreme haste and terrifying sloppiness. His arms, body, and head were not positioned carefully. One of his undershirts had been put on backwards. He'd been left unwashed.
And the coffin?
And most disturbingly, the coffin they built for him was simply too small. The carpenters hadn't measured properly. When they put him in, he didn't fit. So instead of fixing it, they just forced the lid down, nailing it shut with so much pressure that the wood pressed hard against his face, scratching his nose entirely flat.
What does that mechanically tell you about the environment? It tells you the crew was exhausted, they were terrified, the ice was groaning around them, the darkness was absolute, and they were so unnerved by the constant presence of death that they just wanted to get this dead man out of the ship into the frozen ground and get back to the false safety of their steam-heated cabin.
It is a physical, archaeological record of mounting terror.
And the scientific conclusions drawn from the autopsies of these three men completely rewrote the history of the expedition.
They really did. The tissue analysis confirmed of the historical record hinted at. All three men were suffering from severe scurvy. Brain also had extensive evidence of Pott's disease, which is a horrific form of tuberculosis that attacks the spine.
And Torrington.
The autopsy on Torrington concluded that a massive pneumonia infection was the ultimate cause of his death. His lungs were black with coal smoke from the engine room and completely ravaged by infection. But it was the trace element analysis on the hair and soft tissue that dropped the absolute bombshell.
The lead levels.
The lead. The analysis of Torrington's hair showed a staggering lethal lead concentration of 226 parts per million.
226.
To put that catastrophic number in context, Beattie's team analyzed control samples taken from Inuit skeletons from the exact same geographic area for the exact same time period.
Ooh.
The Inuit lead levels were between 26 and 36 parts per million.
Oh my God.
The men of the Franklin expedition were utterly off the charts. They were saturated in it.
So we have to ask the ultimate horrifying question. If they were ingesting massive amounts of toxic heavy metals every single day, their neurological pathways would have been degrading long before the ice permanently trapped them in the Victoria Strait. Does that reframe this entire tragedy?
It entirely reframes the narrative.
Is this not just a story of bad weather and thick ice, but a story of a crew slowly losing their sanity while sailing a toxic ship? Were the fatal navigational decisions made by poisoned minds?
Lead poisoning at that level causes agonizing physical symptoms: crippling abdominal colic, severe fatigue, vomiting. But the neurological symptoms are what doom an expedition.
Brain damage.
It causes severe cognitive impairment, paranoia, mood swings, and a complete breakdown of rational long-term decision-making. It explains the erratic, panicked handwriting in the margins of the Victory Point note. It perfectly explains the madness of dragging heavy, useless Victorian silver and books across the ice. The men were making critical, life-or-death survival decisions with brains that were actively failing them.
And where did this massive dose of lead come from? For a long time, the prevailing historical theory blamed Stephen Goldner. Everyone pointed to those rushed, sloppily soldered food tins dripping with lead wax.
But recent research suggests an even more horrifying systemic source.
What is it?
The tins were unquestionably bad, but modern toxicologists argue they might not have provided the massive, acute daily dose required to reach those staggering 226 ppm levels in the relatively short time between their departure and Torrington's death. Researcher William Battersby pointed out a crucial detail. Tin food was used widely across the entire Royal Navy during this era, and there were no other recorded instances of mass, catastrophic lead poisoning on other ships.
But Erebus and Terror had something completely unique.
Those converted railway locomotive engines.
The steam engines, the very technology that was supposed to save them.
Exactly. Steaming through the ice required an immense amount of fresh water for the boilers, an estimated 1 ton of fresh water per hour. To provide that, the ships were fitted with a unique experimental water distillation system. Given the rudimentary plumbing materials of the 1840s, this massive system utilized a vast network of lead piping and lead-lined storage tanks.
I was looking at the schematics for these distillation systems in the sources, and it is a mechanical nightmare. They essentially built giant lead tea kettles. They boiled the salt water from the ocean, piped the hot steam through miles of lead coils, and condensed it into drinking water.
They were actively brewing toxic water.
But wait, why is it so much worse than regular pipes?
It's the chemistry of the distillation process itself. Distilled water is incredibly pure, which means it lacks the natural minerals found in groundwater. Because it lacks those minerals, it's slightly acidic with a lower pH.
Oh, I see where this is going.
When you run hot, acidic distilled water through lead pipes, it becomes a hyper-efficient solvent. It aggressively strips the lead directly from the walls of the piping, suspending the heavy metal in the drinking water.
Oh my God. Every time they took a sip of water, every time the cook made a massive pot of soup, every time they made a cup of hot tea to warm their freezing hands, they were systematically poisoning themselves.
They were drinking highly concentrated liquid lead.
Their cutting-edge technology, the steam engines that were the absolute pride of the Victorian era, were the exact instruments of their destruction.
It is the most devastating irony of the entire story. They were literally killed by the industrial hubris that put them there. Imagine the biological reality of these men during that final winter. It was a perfect, inescapable storm of horror.
A cocktail of death.
You have scurvy tearing their cellular structures apart, tuberculosis drowning their lungs in fluid, the ice violently crushing the wooden walls around them, and the lead systematically destroying their sanity.
So, what does this all mean? As we zoom out from the graves on Beechey Island, as we pull back from the scattered bones at Starvation Cove, what is the ultimate legacy of this mass tragedy? In a strange, incredibly dark way, Sir John Burrough and Franklin did achieve their goal.
They did, but only through the unintended sacrifice of their men and the massive, frantic rescue efforts that followed. As the historian Richard Syriacs noted, the loss of the expedition added vastly more geographic knowledge to the map than its successful return ever would have.
The searchers did the work.
The dozens of ships that spent a decade searching for Franklin's ghosts ended up mapping thousands of miles of unknown Arctic coastline. They inadvertently mapped the entire Northwest Passage while looking for a crew that was already dead.
But the psychological and financial cost was so staggering, it effectively killed the British appetite for Arctic exploration for an entire generation. It wasn't until Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian explorer who traveled with a tiny crew, lived exactly like the Inuit, wore furs instead of heavy wool, and respected the ice rather than trying to bully it with steam engines.
He was the one who finally conquered the passage in 1903.
Right. And the mystery of the physical ships themselves lingered for over a century and a half. For decades, they were just ghost ships lost in the ice. It wasn't until 2014, during the massive Victoria Strait expedition led by Parks Canada, that the breakthrough finally happened.
An incredible moment.
A remotely operated underwater vehicle picked up the dark, distinct shape of deck planking sitting quietly at the bottom of Queen Maud Gulf. They had finally found HMS Erebus. 2 years later, they found HMS Terror.
Both ships, sitting in the freezing dark, perfectly preserved by the cold water. It is the ultimate enduring cautionary tale about the illusion of human control.
It really is.
We build these massive machines, we pack them with books and silver and steam engines, and we declare ourselves the undisputed masters of the Earth. We assume our technology makes us invulnerable, and the Earth just waits.
Because the Arctic doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't hate you. It isn't evil. It is simply a brutally indifferent physical reality that demands absolute respect. And if you approach it with arrogance, if you prioritize your pride over the mechanics of survival, it will consume you without a second thought, and it will leave no trace but bones in the snow.
Yeah.
I want to leave you, the listener, with one final chilling image. A thought to mull over when you are lying in bed tonight in the safety and warmth of your home, staring into the dark. Somewhere out there on the ice, in late 1848 or maybe even 1849, there was one man left.
The last man.
The absolute last survivor of the 129. He is standing alone in the freezing, howling wind, hundreds of miles from anywhere. His friends are dead. His body is rotting from scurvy. His mind is utterly broken by the lead. And he turns and he looks back through the blowing snow, and he can just barely see the distant outline of those 2 iron-reinforced ships.
Filled with their massive steam engines, their fine china, their library of books.
Sitting dead, unmoving, in the silent dark. What goes through a person's mind when the greatest technology of their era, the pride of the most powerful empire on Earth, becomes nothing more than a lavish, freezing tomb?